What's up, witches? Tonight I'm back with kind of a multifunctional video, if you will. This is going to be both Tacitus Germania Part 2, as well as a video specifically focusing in on Nerthus. Not only the parts of Germania that speak to the little that we know that has been written down about this enigmatic goddess, but I also kind of wanted to elaborate a little bit on why this Germanic goddess is so often also tied with the Vanir gods of Norse mythology, and why she's often said to be a counterpart to the god Njord, who is the father of Freyr and Freya, as well as, it's theorized, the mother of the Golden Twins. So let's get into it. So who is Nerthus? Well, on the matter of Nerthus, as far as Germania goes, Tacitus writes that the Langobardi, which is the Longbeards or Lombards, the Rudigni, the Aviones, and the Angli, who might have been the Angles, share common worship of Nerthus or Eartha, that is, Mother Earth, and the belief that she intercedes in human affairs and visits the lands in her vehicle. So here we see the worship of an earth goddess, so we can gather from this that Nerthus is an earth goddess, perhaps the Mother Earth herself, and that she visits people in her vehicle, which, as it goes on to elaborate later, is a wagon or a wain. And this struck me as something very similar to what I talked about in my video about Frau Holla, where she would be said in old customs and beliefs, even after Christianity took over, to visit the people in the countryside and bestow gifts upon them. So I thought that was interesting that we see this similar thread throughout many different eras in this region of a very similar aspect of goddess worship. So Tacitus goes on to say that on an island in the ocean there is a sacred grove. So once again we see the sacred groves that I touched on in my last video on Germania. And within this sacred grove sits a consecrated chariot covered by a veil. Only one priest is permitted to touch it. He can sense when the goddess is present in this sacred space, perhaps present within the idol itself, and travels with her as she is drawn by female cows in her sacred procession. And this is also interesting because not only do we see sacred cows in India and Hinduism, but if you've seen the Wisdom of Odin's most recent video on the Norse cosmology, the creation myth, it touches there on Audumla, or the sacred cow or space cow. So very interesting that we also see Nerthus, this earth goddess, this fertility and nurturing goddess, driven by female cows, who in many religions and cultures are also viewed as primordial sacred beings. During this sacred procession, it is a season of rejoicing, and festivity follows wherever she deigns to travel, and she is received with great hospitality. Furthermore, during this time, what also seems to be a very common aspect surrounding Nerthus specifically is that they do not go to war or wear arms. Every piece of iron is locked away, and peace and quiet are known and loved during this time, until Weary of human discourse, the goddess retreats to her temple, back to the sacred grove. And so one thing that, you will commonly see about Nerthus worship, or during her sacred time, or during this sacred procession, there would be no conflicts, no wars, no fighting. And it kind of made me wonder if it ties back, or, well, I guess not ties back, but reaches forward into those aspects of Freyr or Hulda related to even Yule or Christmas being just a season of joy, peace, and good cheer. When, people will just lay down arms, put aside conflicts, and come back together in harmony. The part where Nerthus particularly gets, I think, very mysterious and even a little bit spooky, and what is kind of makes her very elusive and enigmatic, is that not only is she covered by a veil during this whole time while she's making this procession, but Tacitus goes on to say that once she's gone back and retreated back into her sacred grove, it says that then the vehicle, the veil, and, if you will believe it, the divinity herself are cleansed in a sacred, secret grotto. Servants minister the rites, and are then themselves given to its waters forever. Hence there remains an ancient fear and ignorant reverence concerning that which only those about to die are able to see. And this, I think, is what really speaks to me the most, and might at first be the hardest concept surrounding Nerthus to grasp. I think even for Tacitus and the Romans during this time, because, even in those times, they were viewing the Germans and the Germanic peoples and tribes as these barbarians. We get the word barbarian from the fact that, the Romans and the civilized folks of those days couldn't understand their language, and so it was all babble to them, and they would just call them barbarians for the way they sounded when they talked. So I think even to Tacitus, perhaps when he was writing this, and especially writing down the practices of these pagans and these heathens that did not follow the civilized Roman ways, to them he even says, if you can believe it, they then will sacrifice everyone who's even looked upon this statue. And so it kind of maybe makes her intimidating or frightening, both then and now, to be like, is she this death cult goddess? If you want to see her or work with her, are you gonna die? Like, what's the deal with this? Is she related to human sacrifice? And I think it's also might tie into the first part of Tacitus that I elaborated on in that earlier video, where it states that there were different forms of executions made for prisoners depending on the crimes, where you would see some would be hanged and some were given as bog offerings. And I think that might also tie into a form of Nerthus veneration or Nerthus offering, is seeing these things offered into the water. But the more I sat and reflected on this concept of Nerthus being this enigmatic, veiled goddess who no one was allowed to gaze upon her form, and even when she would go out to, you would think, see and be seen by the people and give blessings to the countryside, she was still veiled throughout that whole thing, and only the special priests or servants who would cleanse her afterwards would be allowed to actually see the statue. And just that line about this ignorant reverence surrounding that which only those who are about to die are allowed to see. It was when I took my trip out to the mountains of Oregon back in September, and was sitting out there communing with the spirits of the land and just really reflecting on the cycles and Mother Nature, and Nerthus maybe perhaps tied to the earth and the Mother Earth and the cycles of life and death, that I really felt I started to understand on a personal level why this was the case, that perhaps Not only is she a goddess of life, but also a goddess of cycles, a goddess of death. And that being an earth goddess, everything that lives on this earth is at some point also going to die and decay and become part of the earth once again. And so perhaps when you view it under that lens and as just all part of this circle of life, that's perhaps the time when you will finally get to see and truly know this earth goddess, is when you are yourself being embraced by her and returning to her once again. Perhaps that's the only time when any of us are truly going to know her. If there's one thing that first kind of drew me to paganism as a whole and to nature worship as a whole, it was being able to kind of take comfort in that, in a way, that even after I die, I'm going to just become part of the earth again and nourish it as it's nourished me, and still kind of live on through that, in a sense. I can take solace and comfort in that. That's just kind of how I came to view her as a goddess, of not only being an earth goddess, but also just tied as Mother Nature or the Mother Earth to those natural cycles and encompassing both, and maybe being a dualistic goddess in that way. But those brief passages which I just elaborated on, sadly, is really the only time we see Nerthus herself by name mentioned in any of these historical texts, which is why, when I came into this faith and started working closely with the Vanir and Freya and her brother Freyr, and learned that, in the Norse myths, Njord is said to be their father, but as far as Snorri and the Eddas were concerned, their mother is unnamed. We don't know in that mythology, in those stories, who the mother of Freyr and Freya was. But you will commonly see, once you start researching these gods and the Vanir, that it is usually said that Njord and Nerthus are counterparts to each other, much like Freyr and Freya are. And so I started to wonder, why is this the case? Why do we see this Germanic goddess attested to in Germanic tribes and Germanic worship being linked to these Nordic deities and lumped in with the Vanir? Well, we know that it has been said by scholars and etymologists that Nerthus or Nerthus and Njord can be said to be traced back to the same Proto-Germanic root word, Nerthus. And that to me, and this is just me throwing this out there, it could be totally wrong, but I also think it sounds a lot like the rune for Nauthis, or knee. Not only do we see that, much like Freyr and Freya are twin and dualistic deities, where their names are just masculine and feminized versions of the same word, it's commonly said or thought that Njord and Nerthus are just masculine and feminine forms of the same root word. And I was talking to some of my fellow pagans, fellow Vanatru, if you want to call them, about this, because it's also believed, and I've read in some things in my research, that back originally, far back in history, perhaps that the two were originally one whole being, one dualistic, hermaphroditic, masculine, feminine, proto-being, and somewhere along the way they were split into two beings. For me, based on my personal gnosis, and especially with Norse pagans, it's commonly held in many people's personal gnosis that, and just from my few connections that I've had with them, that Njord and Nerthus are very much two distinct personalities, two distinct beings. It is commonly presumed by many that Njord's unnamed sister wife that he was not allowed to keep taking up with after they became hostages to the Aesir in Asgard, that perhaps this unnamed wife and mother to Freyr and Freya could be said to be Nerthus. And after all, we don't know for sure where Vanaheim, the original home of the Vanir, was before Njord and Freyr and Freya went to go live in Asgard. Where were they from? Perhaps these regions where Nerthus came from. Who knows? And another thing that I thought was an interesting similarity is that much like we see Nerthus living in a sacred grove and going out in a wagon or a wain, and her idol being drawn through the countryside, attended by her special priests to give blessings to the land and the people and to be seen by them and receive offerings in return. Freyr, and we've seen some of the texts, would also go on a similar procession, and his idol would be drawn on a wagon throughout the countryside to give fertility and blessings. So it's a very similar practice between the two. And I know that there were also said to be sacred groves set aside to him where special, I couldn't think of the word for a group of horses, special herds of horses, like flocks of horses, where special herds of horses sacred to Freyr would live. So I thought that was an interesting commonality. Some other interesting passages in Germania, which weren't directly so much related to Nerthus, but I also thought were interesting and perhaps related to Freyr and Freya or Vanir worship, was that it was said that among some of the other tribes of the Germanic peoples, there was shown to be a grove of immemorial sanctity. A priest in female attire has charge of it. Not a priestess, but a priest in female attire. And this we can also see in the practice of Sadir, when Freya taught Odin magic, Sadir magic, which was commonly thought to be a feminine practice. He was derided by even Loki for it, and so perhaps that's an interesting feature of Sadir work, and priests and priestesses who worked with it. That it says specifically that a priest in female attire has charge of it, but the deities are described in Roman interpretations as Castor and Pollux, the golden twins, but their name collectively was Alces. And when I did a little bit of just preliminary deep diving into the etymology of this word, one of the things that that Alces might relate to is alges or elhas, which was tied to the elk, the stag gods, and we know Freyr is often also tied to this horned god, this stag god, fertility god imagery. It says that these deities have no idols, no trace of foreign origin, but as brothers and as youths they are worshipped. And so I thought that that might be just an interesting little correlation there into perhaps Freyr and Freya also being worshipped as divine twins. It also states that they worship the mother of gods, commonly said to be Nerthus or Don Danu, and in some of these Baltic tribes they also wear as a religious symbol the device of a wild boar. And we also know from the Norse myths that Freyr and Freya are tied to the images of the boar and have their boars, Gullinbursti and Hildisvini. So perhaps it's not as much of a stretch when you look into some of these features of Nerthus worship and deity worship among the Germanic peoples to find these commonalities that we also see as associations made with the Vanir deities, and specifically Freyr and Freya. I think that it's definitely why you will commonly see Nerthus said to perhaps be a mother of Freyr and Freya. There are similar features to the way that they are worshipped, both in the northern peoples and the Germanic peoples. And it specifically states in Tacitus's works that it is the northern Germanic, the Baltic people who bordered the North Sea and would have had the most close ties and interactions with the Norse and northern peoples, that there might have, just along with sharing common worship of some of these Aesir gods like Odin and Tyr, along with Nerthus, you may have also seen Freyr and Freya shared amongst them. That's really why I thought it would be best to sit down and make a whole separate video, not only on just the parts of Germania that mention Nerthus, as brief as they are, but also just elaborate on them a little bit further as far as why, when you start researching the Vanir gods, you will often see her, even though we only see her mentioned in this account of Germanic tribes, why you will also see her tied in the Norse pagan pantheon with the Vanir gods. I hope that this video was educational and helpful to you. I just really wanted to sit down and not only speak to what we know historically about Nerthus, but also just elaborate a little bit on my own brief UPGs or personal gnosis that I've had while meditating on her and this mother goddess concept and this nature goddess concept as a whole, and what that might mean as far as how we can venerate her. I personally plan on exploring further and would like to work with her further, along with Njord as being Vanir deities. I just find myself leaning toward and resonating with the Vanir as a whole, as I've said many times on this channel. That, unfortunately, is all we really have as far as Tacitus has to say about Nerthus, and I just wanted to help kind of make those connections between why she is often said to be the mother of my favorite golden twins, Freyr and Freya. I hope that you liked this part 2 video, and until the next one, stay classy, pagans.